Hello and welcome to Marketing Management and Brand Identity in the Music Industry. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the guiding principles and the history of the music industry itself. All right, let's begin. Have you ever heard of this song, Rigor Mortis by Cameo? It came out on their album in 1977. The album was called Cardiac Arrest. Now, a gentleman by the name of John P. Kellogg, he was a vocalist on this album. If you want to have a listen, I highly recommend that you go to the YouTube channel and take a listen to the song. It's kind of hip. It's very hip-hoppy. But I bring this up because John Kellogg gave an interview a couple of years ago that talked about this song, Rigor Mortis. Now, in the year 2000, this film came out called Next Friday with Ice Cube. If you have some time, I highly recommend that you go and watch this film. But in this film, this song, Rigor Mortis, came on, and John P. Kellogg, in his interview, talked about how he saw this film, and he heard this song, and he really recognized it. And he's like, man, I know that song so well. And who sings it? Where's it from? He actually looked it up. And sure enough, as soon as the vocalist started singing in the song itself, it was him. And he recognized that it was him. But he never got any credit for that song. He never got any money for that song. In 1977, when they recorded that, he actually only received $100 per week for recording. By traveling, by going to the studio, he only received $100 per week. And so when the song was featured in this film, Next Friday, in the year 2000, he never received any money from it. And so one thing that it's really important to remember is that every time the music gets played, somebody gets paid. Or somebody ought to get paid. Regardless, somebody gets paid in the end. Every time the music gets played, somebody gets paid. And if you're an artist, songwriter, or producer, you should get paid and not played. And we're going to talk about that as part of these guiding principles. There are three guiding principles, the big three. The first of these three guiding principles is the powerful product. Now, this idea of the powerful product can be great. Okay? Married with a great performance by a great recording artist, can be produced by a great producer in a great studio. The product can be many different things, and in today's world, the power of these products is huge. We have audio recordings that can be accessed digitally. We have YouTube videos. We have apps. We have software. We have websites. We even have brands that partner up with musicians to become that much more powerful. For example, Jay-Z partnered up with Samsung in a whole slew of Samsung advertisements. So it's important to have a powerful product. And that comes with being a great musician, having a great performance, having a great producer, and being in a great studio. This is the first of the three guiding principles, the big three P's, powerful product. The next is proper perspective. Many times the fame doesn't equal the fortune, and many musicians out there think, okay, I'm going to create something, and I'm going to be so famous, and I'm going to make all this money, thank you very much, have a nice day. And you're going to buy it. But you have to have proper perspective in order to understand this industry and understand the business itself and how it functions. It's not all about the money. You have to have passion. And if you don't have passion, and if you don't have any love for what you're doing, and you don't have perspective towards that passion, you're not going to make any money, and you're not going to be successful in the music industry. For example, talking about the power of proper perspective, hey, all you English teachers, that's an alliteration for you English students out there. Power of proper perspective, PPP. Probably shouldn't have said that. Okay, talking about the power of perspective, we've got Niles Rodgers. Now, if you never heard of Niles Rodgers, that's okay. I'm going to tell you all about him right now. Now, he's a great guitarist and producer, and he started with a group a very small group called Chic in the 1970s. And the first contract that he ever signed, he thought it was the worst. Okay? He thought it was the worst because he didn't make as much money as he thought it would. And he didn't get everything out of it that he thought it would. His passion was there, his love was kind of there, but he didn't make as much money as he thought it would. And so he thought that that first contract went downhill. He really thought that. But that first contract got his foot in the door. That gave him that perspective. That gave him the realization that this world is not simply about the money. That you have to push. That you have to be driven. That you have to really be into it in order to be successful here. And that first contract provided him the vehicle to display his talent to the world. And even today, he is known worldwide for his music. He has worked and produced with Madonna, David Bowie, Diana Ross, and Daft Punk very recently as a producer. And so perspective is what it's all about. That empathy, putting yourself in others' shoes, being of the realization that it's not all about the money and that there are going to be good times and that there are going to be bad times. The third and last of the final three big principles, guiding principles of the music industry, and I think is the most important one, is having a professional attitude. It's important for you to understand that dealing in the music industry, there are ups and downs, and that your attitude throughout both the ups and downs define who you are as a professional in the industry. As a professional, you should have an understanding of the copyrights, the contracts, the provisions in the contracts, and how everything accounts for one another, and how you fit into those things. Having a positive attitude is really important. Having a respectful attitude is really important. That's the number one thing in this industry, is that you have to have respect for the people that you work with and come in contact with, because you never know who's going to be working with you. You never know when that intern or that receptionist might become the next president of the label that you're involved with. So it's important to have respect. The music industry and the business of music in the intersection of art and commerce and is built around technological innovation and entrepreneurship, especially in the 21st century. 20th century too, but especially today. Many people, as the music industry rose and fell, believe that as the music industry fell, the industry was dead. With the advancements of technology, that's not true. The industry exploded tenfold. Live performance today has reached record growth. Live performance is huge today. Of indie groups, of larger groups, of individual groups, of orchestras, it's huge. The increase in digital sales of both albums and singles, streaming and subscription services has exploded today. The industry is not dead. If anybody tells you that, they are wrong. Carl Sagan, the late great Dr. Carl Sagan, once said, "In order for you to understand your future, you must understand and know your past." And so let's jump back a bit to the beginnings of the music industry, to the 1900s, okay, or the 20th century, the early 20th century. Now, in the early 20th century, sheet music was selling like hotcakes. Sheet music was the thing. The sheet music business, the sheet music industry was huge. And that was the product that everybody wanted to go to. Okay? Many live musicians would create their own music, but they needed sheet music as well. And so the sheet music boomed. After that, the first mechanical reproduction of a song came out in this technological advancement of the piano roll. Now, the sheet music industry thought, holy cow, we are going to die here because of this new technology. But a law came into place. Congress in the United States passed a law called the Copyright Act, which transpired into Canada. It's called the Copyright Act. It has a different there's different kind of wording around the law here in Canada, but it ensured that publishers of the sheet music or publishers of the music that is being played in the piano roll, they still got paid some of the royalties because they truly did believe, the sheet music industry did believe that with the introduction of this technology, that sheet music would die. But that's not the case. Even to today, we use sheet music all the time. Black Swan Records in the 1920s was the first black-owned record company. Many people believed that it was Motown, but in fact it was Black Swan Records, which was founded in New York, in Harlem. Okay, records became huge. After the piano roll, piano rolls were an expensive technology to own, and so people started to buy and produce records. And so Black Swan Records was the first black-owned record company to do this, to create these records on vinyl. In the 1930s, the Great Depression took its toll on the record industry, but out of that, radio became huge. And they brought bands into the studios to play their music. Recording and publishing, the recording and publishing industry were obviously concerned, right? They thought with the advent of radio, people would just come to the radio studios, play live, and nobody was making any money off of this music that people were listening to essentially for free over the radio. But recording studios and labels and publishing companies still received royalties every time a song played. And because of that, because musicians were playing live on the radio, they were being heard all across the country and all across the world. And all of these no-name musicians were getting picked up by these labels and becoming huge record stars. The live music that they were being played over the radio would then transfer over into these big labels, these big industries. Now, CBS, the Columbia Broadcast System, came into play after radio. They also they're still around. CBS still exists today as a big television company. They're huge into media. They own many, many different companies, radio included. But they started featuring prominent artists in their records and over the radio. Now, the record industry took a turn during World War II, right, the late 1930s into the 40s, because lacquer was needed for the war effort. And lacquer was a big kind of component to making records, especially the 78s, which were the 78, the size of the record. Okay, they would move around the turntable at 78 revolutions per minute. Companies could not make records due to this, and the industry thought they were done, right? The record industry thought, holy cow, the war effort is taking all of our lacquer. We can't produce these records. We're not going to be able to make any money. Yeah, music industry, gone, over. That's not true. Radio was still around. And the Armed Forces Radio Network began, and they had 90 radio stations across the entire world, not just in North America, but across the entire world, creating and broadcasting music, not just for Americans. This boosted the record industry once the war was over, because the record industry then could seek out and find these musicians from all over the world to sell their labels to. The instruments themselves and sales and instruments also grew and exploded once soldiers got home, because soldiers who were abroad were listening to jazz musicians like Lester Young, like John Coltrane. They were listening to these jazz musicians, and they wanted to then come home and actually pick up a saxophone and learn how to play it. And that inspired, in 1945, Lawrence Burke, because he knew these soldiers were coming home listening to jazz abroad, and they picked up these saxophones and trumpets and horns and drums and all these instruments that are related to jazz, and he knew that people wanted to learn how to play that music. And so the instrument sales exploded, but also so did the education of the music industry, the education of the music itself and how to play these instruments. And so Lawrence Burke started the Schillinger House, which actually turned into the Berklee College of Music, where people could go learn how to play these instruments in a very professional setting. Now, as we move into the 1950s, we get a lot of innovation. We get a lot of technological innovation. We get a lot of people changing things up. We have a guy named Ahmet Ertegun. Okay, he's from Turkey. He started a label in New York that we all know, Atlantic Records, which then brought in a whole bunch of people, musicians included, and sparked this R&B wave of music. R&B, rhythm and blues, okay? Which actually, rhythm and blues, it used to actually be called race records. But Atlantic Records, founded by Ertegun, right? He really wanted to get things moving. Same with Art Roop. Okay, he started Specialty Records on the West Coast. So as Ertegun on the East Coast started Atlantic Records, Roop started Specialty Records on the West Coast. There were developments in television that impacted the listening of radio. So as radio declined, television rose. And as we will see, moving into the 21st century, or the late 20th century, television would become one of the mainstream ways that people would listen to music. Jukeboxes in the 1950s and 60s enabled people to go into restaurants, drugstores, and simply listen and play music. Now, live musicians didn't like this because there were actually some nightclubs where they would simply have a jukebox, and they would play music from a jukebox instead of having live musicians. And so a lot of live musicians were really angry at the industry for this. But then out of this jukebox era and out of the R&B wave in record labels, rock and roll exploded. The recording industry went from $200 million of income in 1954 to over $604 million in 1958. In 4 years, the income in records exploded by 3 times as much, all because of rock and roll. And because of this, more labels grew. Sam Cooke developed ABC Records, who signed Ray Charles. Now, Sam Cooke was a little bit unique in the fact that he allowed the people that he signed with, the musicians, to actually have major control over their music. And he gave Ray Charles that control as one of the first major artists. We get then to Berry Gordy, who created Motown Records in Detroit. Motown is still huge today, signing the Jackson 5 as one of their main musical groups. Motown, if you Google Motown, you will see all of their musicians that they signed. It's huge. Motown is a huge, huge label and still thriving today. Okay, so let's keep going. In the 1960s, we get the British invasion. The Beatles came to America and kind of exploded the idea of the records. 45s and singles were the predominant form of records at this time in the 60s, and the Beatles helped drive that industry. Now, North American music artists didn't really like this invasion from Britain, especially from the Beatles, because those who were famous before the Beatles came, okay, they really didn't like the fact that the Beatles were thriving, especially the jazz musicians, and some of the other major rock and roll albums. And they didn't like that the Beatles, who were not from North America, were taking over and making all this money and becoming so popular. Eventually things evened out and we get different groups coming out of the United States. Okay, but in the 1960s, things really changed. The technology really changed from records to reel-to-reel audio tape and cassette tape. Okay, this enabled people to take the music from the vinyl records and transfer it to cassettes. Records were kind of clunky, right? Hard to travel around with. You had to keep them in giant boxes and crates, and if you really wanted to listen to music on the go, you had to have these records with you. But cassettes enabled people to really take home music that was in a very small form. Okay, but this created a lot of problems because everyday people thought that they could create their own playlists and make copies of these cassettes, which actually hit the music industry and the record industry really hard as well, because people were just recording themselves and coming out with their own mixtapes, and the record industry didn't like that because they weren't making any money off of it. In the 1970s, disco, huge. Okay, disco in the early 1970s, disco became really, really big. They sold 12-inch singles to clubs that would just play these single tracks over and over and over again. But in the late 70s, 78, 79, disco music dropped off. And people said the industry was dead. There's a nightclub in Chicago that literally had a disco record burning day. They would burn the records because they thought, right, disco's dead. Nobody listened to it anymore. Nobody went to nightclubs to listen to disco anymore, and it was dead. But in the 80s, Sony took over. Right? With everybody thinking that the age of disco is dead, Sony took over and said, hey, you know what? We have these things called cassettes still, but people could only play cassettes at home. Sony in the 80s discovered and built and designed the Walkman. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a Walkman, but Walkmans are small digital portable devices where cassettes could be played. You would hook a set of headphones up and on you go. Just like the main character in the Galaxy of the Guardians movies. But Sony released the first portable cassette player, the Walkman, and it really transformed the industry. Cassette sales exploded. In 1982, though, MTV would revolutionize music on television. And it really hampered the radio industry, especially with the emergence of music videos. In Canada, so MTV, we could get MTV here in Canada, but in Canada we came up with our own version of MTV called Much Music. Still exists today. It's not as exciting because everything we can access on the internet now, but Much Music was really big in Canada as MTV was in the United States. But Michael Jackson came out with the first music video for his song Thriller. And this really... and by the way, Thriller, the music video for Thriller was produced by Martin Scorsese. So the production value was huge. In the early 1980s, the CD came in to replace the cassette tape, even more portable. But many people didn't think it would go anywhere because a CD cost 3 times as much as a vinyl record or cassette tape. But it was promoted as a technology that had superior digital sound, and it was promoted as indestructible, which is not true because you can snap a CD and you can scratch them, which would change or destroy the quality of the CD itself. And they actually came out with portable Discmans to combat and to compete with the Walkman. Now, portable Discmans, there was a time when portable Discmans were considered... You could jog with them, and they wouldn't skip a beat in the song, but that's not true. The laser in the Discman actually always skipped. They would not work that way. In the 1990s, though, CD sales took off as many people tried to replace their vinyl and cassette collections. I have many, many CDs in my collection, as I'm sure your parents do. And CD sales in the 1990s truly were remarkable. But the problem was that the industry made a lot of money off CDs, and they signed so many people and created so many CDs. So that being said, the quality of the music itself actually went down because these labels in the industry just became too greedy. And so you get a lot of, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, boy bands and girl bands and singles of people that truly were not of great quality. But they were making money, so everybody was happy. Then we kind of move into the 21st century. Napster came around, and record sales, okay, CD sales hit a peak in 1999 with $14 billion. Now remember, okay, records going from 600 million all the way up to 14 billion in 1999, that's insane. Okay, but Napster burst this bubble of the CD sales, and CD sales plummeted because when Napster came out, people, with the technological advancement of computers, people could download music for free. So nobody was really making any money. The company Napster was making money, but nobody could make any money. The labels couldn't make money. The musicians weren't making any money. And so the idea of illegally sharing files, music files, really put a hamper on the industry itself. And labels lost a lot of money because of this. But in 2003, Steve Jobs, who has now passed away, and you can see here in the photo, this is Steve Jobs with hair. He passed away, but he created Apple, the company Apple, Macintosh. First started as a computer company, then it moved into music, and in 2003, Apple came up with a new way to access and purchase music online, a digital distribution system called iTunes that we still use today. And accompanied with iTunes, he created the iPod and the iPod Shuffle. Now, this was the first iteration of the original iPod that you see here, okay? And this would then combat the Discman and the Walkman, because everybody could then download as much music as the technology could hold without having 1,000 CDs or 1,000 cassette tapes. iTunes returned the idea of the single as being the predominant configuration of music in the industry itself. You could purchase single songs from an album that you liked. Because a lot of times when you purchase an album of a band that you like, you're not necessarily liking all of the songs on that album. You may like 2 or 3. Steve Jobs and Apple gave us that opportunity. Radio also evolved with satellite radio, XM and Sirius satellite radio, where you could receive radio signals for any type of music. Whereas traditionally in the radio, you had to listen to whatever they played. With satellite radio, you can have specific stations that played rock, specific stations that played jazz. This was the first time people were paying monthly for music. This was the first time music subscriptions came along. iTunes did not have a subscription service in the early 21st century as they do now. The internet radio service called Pandora, which still exists today, it's not as popular as it used to be, but it allowed people to register for service and listen to music for free. We have streaming services like Spotify and Rhapsody, where people can subscribe and actually upload their own music. Spotify was one of the first streaming services that was able to negotiate licenses with all of the major labels and many independent labels to allow for unlimited access to a wide catalog of music. The creator, so Steve Jobs with iTunes and Spotify, who was created not by Steve Jobs, they both shut down the idea of Napster. And there was a huge legal battle to get Napster to essentially shut down and to have to pay the music industry hundreds of millions of dollars. Derek Sivers, he started CD Baby. If you've never heard of it, I would highly recommend you check it out. It's a digital service that allows you to order CDs. You can get CDs mailed to you directly. Now they can be delivered to you. Just like how Netflix first started, you had to order them through through online, and they would they would mail you the actual DVDs or Blu-rays, and then you'd have to send them back, and they would give you more. Another one is called Sonic Bids. This is a company that was started by Panos Panay, which created a virtual talent agency and booking agency, as well as providing a number of other services. Panos Panay and Derek Sivers both actually are alumni of the Berklee College of Music that we talked about. And that's it, folks. Thank you so much. And I hope you all have an awesome week ahead. Please don't forget to answer the questions on our Google Classroom discussion. Bye for now. Adios.